11. I'm Joanna Kline. I think people have been, everyone here has been to the other weeks of this series, but we started with Adam and Eve a couple weeks ago. Last week we talked about Cain and Abel. This week we're going to talk about Noah and the flood. This is from chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis, so it's 4 chapters. It's a lot of material. There will be a lot of text that we won't be able to cover, but if you want to look along in your Bible, I don't have a handout today, but thankfully we've got the PowerPoint working. So feel free to look along in your own Bibles, and I'll also have text up here on the screen. This is also the passage that Jews read this weekend in the synagogue, the parashat Noah in Judaism. So just interesting coincidence that we're reading the same passage as our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world are. And then next week will be our last week talking about this genealogy in Genesis 10 and the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. So let's pray together as we begin. Lord, we praise you for being the creator and sustainer of our beautiful world. Praise you for your grace and the way that you sustain the world despite all the failings of humans. In Genesis 6, we see that violence has filled the earth before the flood, and that's still, sadly, our situation today. Please interrupt those cycles of violence that we see around us. Please be with the victims of violence. Bring your justice and peace, and please, as bearers of your image, help us to do the work of bringing justice and peace as well. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so as I said, we won't be able to cover this whole text, but I'll try to be continuing to trace this theme of the positive and negative ways that people are being like God in a good way, bearing God's image, walking with God, or trying to go outside of their bounds to be like God. So we saw with Adam and Eve, God makes the humans as images of God, as God's representatives on the earth, to rule the earth in a just way, and to be God's priests and kings on the earth. But then in the garden, they try to be like God, as the serpent says, that when you eat this fruit, you'll be like God. They try to be like God in a way that God didn't make them to be, and know good and evil. Although God already had made the earth good for them, they want to know good and evil for themselves in this way that kind of to find it for themselves rather than in God's way. And we see the consequences of that playing out in the Cain and Abel story, where Cain does the kind of ultimate, overreach and perhaps being like God in a negative way of taking life and death into his own hands and killing his brother. And then we see that over the course of Cain's line, the violence increases until we get to the 7th generation, Lamech, who is taking violence into his own hands, taking revenge into his own hands, and he says he's avenging himself sevenfold for anybody who is going to hurt him. And so we see that kind of violence of his line increasing. Whereas the line of Adam and Eve's next child, Seth, is the one that begins to call on the name of the Lord. And we'll see that word name coming up in this narrative as well, and it's going to be important in Genesis 10 and 11. That line of Seth begins to call on the name of the Lord, so somehow they recognize God's name, and they're appealing to God in a positive way. And we'll kind of see both of those things continuing as we go on. Just as we start to think about Noah and the flood and think about what this story is about, a lot of times in our culture we see the flood as, this is the representation of the flood. Actually, we have this toy at home. The kids' toys or picture books, because, animals are cute. So this is sometimes the representation of the flood that we get. Here's a kind of totally opposite image. This is from the Brick Testament. It's a website that has just the Bible built in Legos. And it's very irreverent. And the person, the creator of it, loves to highlight negative things from the Bible. Even though, it follows the Bible pretty closely, but you can see in the images that he likes to highlight just these negative things. And so here's Noah and his family at the end of the flood, getting off the ark, and the ground is just littered with skeletons. And so it's kind of the opposite view of the flood. And I think, sometimes we go to either one of these images or the other, thinking of just this kind of story of God saving the animals or versus the flood as a really kind of terrible, difficult story of God's judgment. I'll just ask you right off the bat, how have you thought of this story of the flood? Is it a difficult story? Is it a comforting story? Is it about God's judgment? Is it about God's grace?
Yes.
Yes. Say more, Sandy.
Well, as with most things in the Bible, it's a combination, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
It's a horrifying story. It's not a happy story. I mean, there's happiness at the end for some, and there's the rainbow, but the rainbow isn't comforting. It means that we won't ever be drowned again, but the fire is going to get us the next time.
Well, that's mentioned later. Yeah. So Sandy said it's both a terrifying story, but also, as with many things in the Bible, it's a both and story about God's judgment and God's grace. Becky?
It also makes me wonder, what is the difference God expected in humanity before the flood and after?
Yeah.
In other words, what was God's purpose in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe we can. So Becky asked, "What's God's purpose? What does God expect out of humanity before and after the flood? What does the flood do?" Maybe we can think about that as we talk about the text today.
Can I say one thing that sort of helped me? I think way years and years ago, I read a translation that said that the earth was corrupt, full of violence. God saw that everybody's ways were violent and corrupt, and his heart was filled with pain.
Yeah.
And that kind of helped somehow. He wasn't just doing it vindictively because he was angry.
Yeah.
It wasn't the way he wanted his creation to be.
Right. Yeah. So Sandy points out this text that God's heart is filled with pain, and actually, God isn't angry. Sometimes we think of God being angry and that being an emotion attached to God in this text, and that we do see that sometimes in the Bible, that language about anger being used about God, but actually that's not used in this passage. It is is pain. God's heart is pain. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think it might be this way of getting people to know how to think.
Uh-huh.
And instead of drowning.
Okay, so God is expecting people to think about what's going on and have the opportunity to be saved.
More set them apart
Mm-hmm.
from others by learning how to talk and think and do everything except just right to left and
Yeah.
right.
So kind of wake up call for humans.
And if you think about it, it took Noah a while to build the ark, so people had a chance to say, what are you doing, and why are you
Mhm.
doing it, and what's going to happen. So maybe, like in other places, Jonah,
Yeah.
God might have changed his mind if enough people were.
Yeah. So Sandy's suggesting that given the time that it would take Noah to build the ark, people could have seen that and repented, and perhaps even the flood could have been averted in that case. That's a good point. Jonathan?
Yeah, just two kind of language comments to piggyback off of what Sandy was saying with both of her comments. That one is that in 6:6 it says, and maybe we'll talk about this, but like God changed his mind. It's that word that is either he repented that he had made humanity on the earth, but it's that same word that's used to like he changes his mind other places in terms of like positive too, like he relents, I think. And then, but the other thing that's interesting that really struck me that I never noticed was that in that same verse, when, as you both were saying, when it says his heart was sad or he was pained, that's the same word that's used for Eve, pain and childbearing, and then Noah's gonna rescue humanity from their pain.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's
I was going to get there. Thank you.
sorry. sorry, I should not.
in God's heart that Sandy brought up is the same word that's about Adam's toil of the ground, Eve's pain in labor, and then at the end of the genealogy, the pain that Noah is supposed to bring comfort for. And so God is experiencing this same kind of pain that the humans have brought upon themselves. All right, feel free to chime in at any time with questions and comments as we go on. So this genealogy is one we looked at the end of last time. I just want to remind us of it, and I guess we didn't have the image last time because my PowerPoint wasn't working. This is the 10 generations in Genesis 5 from Adam to Noah. So Adam has his son Seth, then Seth has a son Enosh, which is another name for man, humanity. And then it continues. Then we have Enoch. He's the one who walks with God, and then he was not because God took him. So we don't know what happened to him, but he walked with God, which is also said about Noah. So we do have a kind of this 7th generation person who's walking with God, and then he is with God somehow. God takes him. And then we have Noah, who also is righteous and walks with God, and who is a kind of, there's this kind of hope that he's a new Adam. So he's in this 10th generation from Adam, and then this text we looked at last time, his father calls him Noah, and the root there is these 2 letters that I represented with the N and the H. So his name is Noah, and Noah's father said, he will comfort us. That's the word Jonathan was talking about, that is the same word that is used when God regrets that he makes humans. We'll see that in a minute. But it can also mean comfort. He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil. So that's the word about that is the same as what happens in God's heart. The painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. So interesting, Noah is named Noah because he's going to comfort the people, and that has 2 of the same consonants as Noah's name. But really, Noah, the name means, is related to the verbal root that means to rest or to place something. It can be literal, like human rest, like resting. Sometimes it's used in the context of Sabbath rest in later passages of Scripture. But it also can mean to place something, to put something down. So it's the same. This verb is used when the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. It's that same verbal root that Noah is from. So Noah really means to rest. But it's connected with this word comfort, which, as we'll see, is used about God in a minute. So, as I said last time, we have these, in Genesis 1 through 11, the genealogies play this kind of structuring role in the narrative. So it goes narrative, genealogy. So what we're looking at, the text we're looking at today, Genesis 6 through 9, is between 2 genealogies. This genealogy in Genesis 5, Adam to Noah, and then we have the genealogy from Noah to Shem in Genesis 10. We'll pick up with that next time. But I think sometimes, genealogies can be very boring and hard to read because they're repetitive, and this guy lived this many years. But they actually do something in the narrative. They help to structure it. They also, here in this text, I think they help to show that theme of fruitfulness, being fruitful and multiplying. That's so important in Genesis ever since chapter 1, so they show that theme. And then they help us see kind of the chosen line. When you're following, you can see which genealogies dead end, like Cain's genealogy dead ends, and which genealogies are picked up again, like this one, the Adam-Seth genealogy, will be picked up again in Genesis 10. So this is just a kind of background to what we have when we turn into Genesis 6, which, when we turn there, starts out with a very strange story in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It says, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, or literally good, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown, literally men of name. So I'm going to say something in a minute about the sons of God. Who are they? The 120 years, what does that mean? The Nephilim. All of those are huge questions from this narrative. But just first off, I want to point out this connection between seeing something good and taking it. Might sound familiar because those are the same words that are used in Genesis 3:6 when Eve the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good, and she took it. So seeing something good and taking is already a pattern that we saw something that we saw in Genesis 3 and is repeated here. So already seems to have, if we read it in light of that, something negative probably going on, seeing something good and taking it. And then I also want to point out that word name, as I said, in the genealogy, we see that people are starting to call on the name of the Lord. Actually, that's a previous genealogy, not the last one. Or maybe it is the last one. Anyway, they begin to call on the name of the Lord. Oh, it's in Genesis 4. After the birth, that's not in the genealogy. After the birth of Seth, that's when people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. That seems like a positive thing. And here we have these heroes that are men of name. In this idea of making a name for yourself will become really important when we get to next week and the Tower of Babel. That's what people are trying to do, is make a name for themselves. And also the son that we follow from Noah's sons that the genealogy follows, his name is Shem, and Shem means name. So like the son that we focus on as we're moving towards Abraham, his name is name. And then we have these people are trying to make a name for themselves. Here we have these men of name. So name I think it has can have both a positive and a negative connotation, but we'll focus more on that next week. But just to point out here that these heroes of old are men of name. So we have something going on. We'll talk about what is going on with the sons of God and daughters of men. But also just to point out that besides this situation, or maybe because of this situation, we also have this is in verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And so we see how far things have come from when God created the earth to be good and made it good for humans and animals to live in. Then the people want to know good and evil, but how sad that leads to them being evil all the time, only evil all the time in their hearts. And so this is the situation that we have before the flood. Although there is a positive aspect with Noah, it's not everybody evil all the time. We do have Noah being a righteous person in his generation. But the situation is looking pretty bad. All right, I'm going to talk about these sons of God figures. And there's basically two major interpretations. Either these are regular people or they're divine beings. On the regular people side, some people have thought that perhaps they're just people, and sons of God is a way of just saying people, because, Adam was created by God, and then God's image gets passed along. So some people have said there's nothing really wrong here. It's just a way of talking about normal people. Maybe what's going wrong is possibly with the daughters of men, maybe there's a situation of polygamy or possibly sexual violence or something like that in that case, if there's something going wrong. Other people, this interpretation isn't advanced very often, but some people have seen the sons of God as the people from the line of Seth, and the daughters of men as the people from the line of Cain. But there's not really much in the text to support that. Some people have thought of these sons of God as human rulers, because in the ancient world, people thought of themselves, kings were thought of as gods or sons of gods. And so some people have thought of these as rulers, kind of trying to exercise their power by taking whatever wives they want, and that's something obviously we see in history. So that's a possibility. The Luke reference is Jesus talking about a coming judgment, and Jesus says, just as in the days of Noah, people were marrying and giving in marriage and eating and drinking, and they didn't know that the judgment was coming. So some people have brought up that passage to say it's just a normal situation of people getting married, and like that would be reflected in Jesus' comment. But overwhelmingly, in the history of interpretation, people have seen these sons of God as divine beings. That in kind of ancient interpretation and continuing today, the more prominent view is to see the sons of God as divine beings. That's because when the phrase is used elsewhere in the Bible, including these passages in Job, but there's a couple other places as well, sons of God are some kind of divine beings. We may call them angels. They're not, angels is distinct in the the Hebrew Bible from these sons of God, but some kind of beings who are with God. And so the sons of God coming and marrying daughters of men would be a kind of inappropriate mixing of divine and human realms. And kind of interesting, I think, when we think of the theme of humans trying to be like God, overstepping their bounds. We have something perhaps similar here, but maybe even the opposite movement of gods being like people in an inappropriate way. So, humans are not supposed to step out of their bounds to be like God. Also, gods, sons of God, are not supposed to step out of their realm and be getting together with humans. One of the places that you see this interpretation develop the most is in this really interesting collection of literature from Second Temple Judaism called First Enoch. And the Enoch literature, I think I mentioned it last time, there comes to be a whole body of literature in ancient Judaism written from the perspective of this figure of Enoch. And this is common in that time to write literature using the perspective of a famous person. So you have like the Testament of Abraham, Testament of Moses. You have a lot of literature that's ascribed to famous people during this time period. It's a way of interpreting the Bible, really for the most part, before people start writing commentaries, explicit commentaries. This is often a kind of way to like think through biblical texts and apply it to people's own time, is to write in the name of these famous people. And so the Enoch literature, even First Enoch, is actually a collection of texts. But one part of it is called the Book of the Watchers, and that is a kind of expansion on this story. It was probably written around the 3rd century BC, and for a long time it was only preserved, it was written in Aramaic, but it was only preserved in Ethiopic by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and that's how we knew of this literature. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the Aramaic copies, not the entire thing, but copies or pieces of the text were found. So we know that people living at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, that sectarian group was using this literature. It's apocalyptic in nature, so it's about the coming judgment and kind of ordering the times in a certain way. And I thought I'd just read you a couple excerpts because this kind of fills in the gaps, kind of interprets this story, and you can really see this idea that these are angels or divine beings that are coming to be with humans. So I'll just read you a couple excerpts from this. It says, "When the sons of men had multiplied, in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the watchers, the sons of heaven, so I think that watcher's name is used in Daniel for angels or divine beings. So the watchers are these angels. The watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves.' So they have this little conversation among themselves. They list all these angels who are coming down. And then it says, 'These and all the others with them took for themselves wives from among them, such as they chose. And they began to go into them, and to defile themselves through them, and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants. And they conceived from them and bore to them great giants. And the giants begot Nephilim, and to the Nephilim were born Eliud, and these were growing in accordance to their greatness.'" So they have these children that are giants, including the Nephilim, which I'll talk about in a minute. "They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill men and to devour them. And they began to sin against the birds and beasts and creeping things and the fish, and to devour one another's flesh. And they drank the blood," which is interesting, I think, in light of what we'll see at the end of the flood. God allows eating of animals, but prohibits anybody from eating the blood. So these giants are eating everything around them, including the animals, eating the blood. "Then the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. And Asael, who's one of these watchers, Asael taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed them metals of the earth and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women." And then it goes on and lists all these different angels who taught the humans different things about spells and sorcery and magic. So in this text, it's not only the problem of these sons of God mixing with the daughters of men and having these giants, that's one problem. But also they're teaching humans all this kind of forbidden knowledge about magic and things like that. That's another, and giving them weapons of violence. So that's another problem. And then it says, as men were perishing, the cry went up to heaven. So the people who are dying are crying out to God, and then these good angels hear them. So Michael and Sariel and Raphael and Gabriel looked down from the sanctuary of heaven upon the earth and saw much bloodshed on the earth. And the earth was filled with the godlessness and violence that had befallen it. And so these angels go to God, and they say, these people are crying out, the people who are suffering from violence are crying out for your justice. And so it's actually kind of, in this text, the people who are dying are crying out to God in order for God to bring judgment, which is kind of interesting. And so the angels ask God what to do, and then this is what God says. Then the Most High declared, and the great Holy One spoke. He sent Sariel to the son of Lamech, saying, Go to Noah and say to him, Hide yourself, and reveal to him that the end is coming, that the whole earth will perish, and tell him that a deluge is about to come on the whole earth and destroy everyone on the earth. Teach the righteous one what he should do, the son of Lamech how he may preserve himself alive and escape forever. From him a plant will be planted, and his seed will endure for all the generations of eternity. To Raphael he said, Go, Raphael, and bind Asael hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. Throw him there, and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones, and cover him with darkness, and let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover up his face, and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment he will be led away to the burning conflagration. And heal the earth, which the watchers have desolated, and announce the healing of the earth, that the plague may be healed, and all the sons of men may not perish, because of the mystery that the watchers told and taught their sons. And all the earth was made desolate by the deeds of the teaching of Asael, and over him write all the sins. So I'll stop there. There's more. So eventually all the good angels, God's servants, bind up the bad watchers, and they're living in the depths of the earth awaiting judgment. And then Enoch goes and talks to them, and they ask Enoch to ask God to intervene, to intercede to God for them. God says, Enoch does, but God says, no, you're going to be punished. And then Enoch goes on some more adventures. Interesting, if you look up the New Testament passages here, the 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Jude, you have these texts about spirits who are in prison, awaiting judgment, and they seem to be also in the context of Noah. So some of them mention Noah and the flood nearby. So seem to be possibly familiar with a tradition like this. And Jude 6 actually quotes Enoch, a verse right at the beginning of Enoch, which I didn't read, but quotes First Enoch. So at least some of the New Testament writers seem to be familiar with this text, or at least the traditions around this idea that you had this, rebellious angels, rebellious divine beings who came and got together with the daughters of men, and now they're awaiting judgment, awaiting God's judgment. And also interesting, I think, just that, it's talked about, the flood is a cleansing of the earth, and God kind of healing. He's used that language of God's healing the earth from all these things that these bad beings did, yeah.
So, if I'm hearing you right, what you're sketching is a kind of second fall, where instead of Adam and Eve sinning, angels are sinning.
Yeah.
And that almost seems to present a sense of God as compelled to do something extraordinary because there are these divine beings that are disobedient in the same way that mankind was? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the history of Judaism and Christianity too, there's always a kind of tension to me between the question of where does evil come from, and in both cases evil would be a rebellion against God, but is it primarily something that's within the human heart, or is it something coming from outside, some kind of satanic, demonic forces that is a kind of supernatural. Is evil coming from more from like this outside of human supernatural force, or is it evil coming from within human hearts? And in the Old Testament, for the most part, I think emphasis is on human evil, in evil of human hearts, and there's not a lot about demons or the rebellious angels. And even in Genesis 6, if you just read that alone, it's it doesn't tell you a lot of information. But I think it's, and I think it's probably a both and in both traditions, but there is a little bit of a kind of tension, I think, is evil something that's primarily coming from us? Is it primarily kind of outside evil force? And that outside evil force becomes more of a strong idea, I think, in Second Temple Judaism, and also to a certain extent in the New Testament. Yeah, Bruce?
Isn't the whole narrative, though, drifting towards this problem of human beings, quote unquote, making a name for themselves, and maybe angels also trying to make a name for themselves?
Right.
And it's this catastrophic rebellion where everything's out of order.
Yeah.
The
Right.
lower is now ascribing to itself power and
Right.
authority and glory.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. I mean, these rebellions could both be seen as essentially the same thing, of trying to make a name for yourself, trying to put yourself in a place that you're not supposed to be with regard to God in that created order. Yeah, that's a good point.
But it seems to beg the question of who God is. If God brings and allows these divine beings to enter into this, to this world and screw it up so badly.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as though, yes, it does. It seems as though God has allowed, and that's most people have answered, that a certain amount of freedom among humans and also among divine beings, and the freedom for them to be able to do things like this.
So
Yes.
where does the fall of Lucifer come into all this?
So, the text about the fall of Lucifer, that's in Isaiah, right? Is that Isaiah? I saw Lucifer falling, the dawn, the morning star.
Yeah.
It's within the Old Testament, it's hard to actually build that up as a theology, but people do appeal to that one text, which in its context doesn't look like it's about Satan. I think but perhaps it's kind of a bigger interpretive tradition, I think, that takes that text and uses it kind of in the context of this fall. I can't remember if that's reflected on at all in the Enoch literature or not, if it's more in the Christian tradition that develops. Did you want to say something, John?
Oh, just that it's a lament about the king of Tyre.
Right, that's what I thought it was
so
about.
it's a human ruler, and it's basically, but it has this language like he ascended the a mountain of God or something. So, and then
Right.
it says
There's another one. There's basically two texts that are used. One is this one in Isaiah, the lament of the king of Tyre. And the one is in Ezekiel. Or is that the Ezekiel one you're talking about? There's one in Ezekiel about you were a cherub in the garden of God.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And so it's really not in the Old Testament. But I think there's those passages in the Old Testament plus maybe a couple in the New Testament that people take and kind of put together in order to come up with that story about Satan, falling from heaven or being a rebellious angel. But it probably also is similar to these ideas that come out of Judaism in terms of that there were these rebellious divine beings. And so that's probably the bigger context, is that this idea of rebellious divine beings. But if you're just reading the Old Testament, you're not going to see that clearly. And even in the New Testament, not super clearly laid out, right?
Yeah, I think it's like John Milton is
Okay.
probably that idea.
I'll just go on and talk about some of the other pieces in this text. So God says, my spirit isn't going to abide with them forever, or the word for abide is not necessarily known what it means. It could be contend. But anyway, he said their days will be 120 years. There's two interpretive options basically for what that means. Their days will be 120 years. Most people read this as a shortened human lifespan because we see in the genealogy people are living hundreds of years, and God says their days are going to be 120 years. What's kind of difficult is that even after the flood, people are still living longer than 120 years, but the lifespans do get shorter after the flood. And so like a character like Moses lives to 120 years. And so if 120 years may be seen as kind of the maximum human lifespan, which even today, biologically, it basically is, even though hardly anybody reaches that. But, something around that is the kind of maximum human lifespan. So if that's the case, God didn't immediately, make this 120 years the lifespan, because the lifespans are still longer, but they do decrease. So that might be it. Another interpretation, this goes back to ancient times, is that 120 years is the time before the flood. So their days will be 120 years, means in 120 years, I'm going to bring the flood. And that would allow for like the time of building the ark. And in that case, 120 years is almost like a period of time in which people presumably could have gotten their act together. It's kind of like a grace period and before the flood. So God doesn't immediately bring the flood, but in 120 years he does. Both of these interpretations make sense to me. I don't know which one is better. The Nephilim are, the word is related to the verb to fall. So sometimes people speak of these as fallen ones, like going along with that fallen angels thing. But also it's an active verb. So some people interpret it as the falling, those who would fall upon someone like in battle. So they're like warriors. Some translations use the word giants. This goes all the way back to the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, and the Targums, which are ancient Aramaic translations. And if you look at the only other time that Nephilim is used in the Bible, it's Numbers 13:33, when the people come into the land of Canaan. They're spying out the land that God has promised them, and the people there are giants. So they said, like, let's see, I can't remember the exact language. We saw the Nephilim there, the Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. So that's the report of the spies, which of course then things go wrong because nobody wants to go take the land except for Joshua and Caleb, and then they have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Anyway, there's these giants in the land, and the Nephilim aren't the only giants. There's Rephaim, and there's all these other figures. So there are these like giants in the land of Canaan. Whether they're supposed to be the same thing as the Nephilim, that's not clear. But that's why some translations might say giants here. I think there's a midrash where one of the Nephilim like hangs on to the outside of the ark and like survives the flood, and that's how the Nephilim are still around in the land of Canaan. But perhaps it's just kind of like a generic term. At any rate, the Nephilim, either they're human warriors. The text doesn't actually explicitly say that these are the children of the sons of God and daughters of men, but that's often been a way that they have been understood as the Nephilim are the offspring, and that's how the Enoch literature understands it. That's not, like I said, it's not absolutely made it explicit in the Genesis text. So some people just think these are like kind of these heroes. But you have lots of other things in Greek mythology and other places of kind of like semi-divine, semi-human, mighty warriors. Here, if that's what this is, it's a very negative picture of those. And these are the men of name, the heroes of old, the men of name around here at this time, which is a negative picture. And then, as we've already said, we have human evil in verse 5 about the people's hearts are evil all the time. It's a kind of a result of people trying to be like God on their own, and that's the picture that we have, is this people being evil, and this whatever it is, whatever's happening here, is a very negative scene. And then it goes on to talk about the earth being filled with violence is another thing that God sees. Any other questions or comments before I go on?
So appropriate for our time.
Yeah. All right, so this is what happens next. It says, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. And this is obviously theologically a difficult issue. But this word regret, this root, naham, is the same one that's used about Noah bringing comfort. So when it's used in a certain form, it can mean to regret or to change one's mind or to relent. But in another form of it, it can mean to comfort. So it's kind of interesting that that root connected with Noah's name now appears here. And so the Lord said, his heart was deeply troubled. So this is the verse that Sandy brought up, that his heart was deeply troubled, it was deeply pained, and it's that same kind of pain that Adam is experiencing in working the ground, and women are experiencing in pain in childbirth. God also is experiencing that same pain. And so interesting kind of, that people being like God, people trying to be like God, but God is actually kind of entering into human pain here too, and intimately involved in that human pain. And the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals and the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. All those categories that were made in this beautiful picture of Genesis 1 about the creeping things and the birds and the animals and the humans, it's going to be this uncreation, as we'll see with the flood. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So Noah, here his name is played on again because that word for favor, hen, is just a reversed consonants of Noah. So it's almost like something in Noah's character is so good that Noah found favor is just, Noah and favor, hen, are just the reverse letters of each other. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this terrible situation on the earth, people's hearts are evil all the time. We do have this figure who found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he's a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. So just like Enoch, that same language is used. Enoch walked with God, and Noah walked with God. And so, even in this terrible picture where humanity has lost their way and perhaps even became enmeshed with divine beings, we do have this positive figure of Noah. And so Noah is like God in a good way. He doesn't use that language, but he's walking with God. He's like God. He's presumably living out that image bearer job in a positive way. And we don't really hear what that means, but we do hear all these positive things about him. He found favor. He's righteous, blameless, and he walked with God. And maybe even an image, kind of return to the garden type of image. We have already seen Noah as like a new Adam figure. He's the 10th generation from Adam. His father said he's going to bring comfort from the work that we do from the ground that was cursed. And this idea, we see God walking in the garden in Genesis 3, and so maybe an image of that return to the garden with Noah walking with God. I'm not going to get into it a lot, but some of you are probably familiar with some of the ancient Near Eastern flood stories. We talked about, when we talked about creation, we talked about the Babylonian creation account, Enuma Elish. There's also flood accounts that are kind of similar to that, where we have a lot of similarities with the creation accounts, but some differences. One of them is found in the Gilgamesh epic, so that's an easy text to find if you're interested in reading that. Part of it is Gilgamesh, this king, seeks out this guy Utnapishtim, who's the Noah figure who was able to survive the flood in a boat. And that story probably goes back earlier than the Gilgamesh epic. There's also one called Atrahasis. And just to point out a couple of the differences between those accounts and the biblical flood account is that, for example, in Atrahasis, the gods are annoyed because humans are too noisy, and so that's why they whip them out, because they're making too much noise, which was also a problem in Enuma Elish, that humans make too much noise. Some of you can relate. And in Gilgamesh, for example, the gods are going to wipe everybody out. They're not going to save anybody. But this one rogue god, he warns Utnapishtim, like, this is what's going to happen, so you better build a boat so you can survive it. So the plan is to wipe everybody out and get rid of them all in the Mesopotamian accounts. But in the Bible, similarly, one family is saved, although some of the ancient Near Eastern ones did get craftspeople on the boat and stuff too, more than one person. But God is planning from the beginning to save a family and to work through that family. in contrast to the Mesopotamian accounts where everybody is supposed to be wiped out. And so that's one of the important differences. And also this idea of God kind of entering into that human pain is also distinctive. It's not God being annoyed or capricious or something about in some of these accounts. So when we get to the flood picture, there's a lot of text here, and we won't be able to talk about all of it. But we have this picture of a reversal of creation. So what we had in Genesis 1 now is reversed, and I'll just highlight a couple of texts there. So we already saw this one. I'll blot out the humans whom I've created from the face of the land, people and animals, creeping things, and birds of the heavens. So those same categories that we see in Genesis now are being wiped out. And then it says, towards the beginning of the flood account, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. So we have the waters below, so there's the idea of the waters below the earth coming up from above, and then the windows of heaven, there's a kind of vault above the heaven in the ancient Near Eastern conception of the earth, and that's holding back the waters, and all the waters are coming through the windows of the heaven and filling the earth. And that's just what was separated in Genesis 1. God separated those waters above the earth and the waters below the earth and made them separate from each other. That enabled the rest of creation. But now all those waters go back, and we saw that first week about how the watery chaos, the waters are a picture of chaos, a symbol of chaos. And so now you're back into that undifferentiated chaos waters. Except that you have the ark, this little world with Noah and his family and the animals being saved in the midst of that. That word ark is also used about what Moses gets put into as a baby. So when Pharaoh is killing all the babies, Moses' mother puts him in an ark of reeds and puts him into the water, into the Nile. And so Moses also goes through the water in an ark, and he's saved. It's a different word. A different word is used about the Ark of the Covenant. It's different, but this word ark is only used about Noah's ark and Moses' little mini baby ark that he's saved in through the waters. And then at the end of the flood, we have all these elements of new creation. So we've had this creation, uncreation, and now a new creation. So just kind of listen as I read, and hope you can see some elements that remind you of creation. It says, "The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humans, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings. Each one for the blood of another I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humans." So what do you notice here about the recreation of this picture? What stands out to you? Yeah, Bruce?
Well, it's that same amazing fact that God is creating us to be like God.
Yeah.
Again.
Right.
Second chance, you know?
Mm-hmm.
What's also interesting is that this is God giving this. We're not grasping and taking this.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because there's nothing for us to grasp and take.
Right.
It's all been taken away.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. Becky?
It just makes me think of a question. Is there any place now that God defines what he means by image, his image for humans? Because humans have the wrong conception sometimes
Right.
about what being the image is. So God must have some kind of paradigm for humans to act in his image.
Right. I mean, how I've thought about it and talked about it here is the idea of humans being God's representatives, and I think we see that in chapter 1, the idea that humans are supposed to have dominion over the earth and rule it. They're like God's kings, they're God's kings on the earth, or we could think of them as God's priests, and that those words, like when Adam is put in the garden to work it and to keep it, are words that are used around tabernacle and temple service. So, humans as God's priests or kings, but God doesn't spell it out. But exactly, I mean, you could see, you could think of maybe some of the, the instructions in the Torah that are later given to Israel as God spelling that out more. And God says, you're going to be a kingdom of priests for me. And so you have a kind of, I think that idea that, all humans are made in God's image, but then God makes Israel especially as this kingdom of priests to represent him on the earth. And so you could see some of those things as spelling out more what that would look like. But it doesn't explain it, but it is possible, because Noah seems to be doing it right. Abraham, at least at points, is doing it right.
Noah is righteous.
Right.
So there must be a definition of righteous that humans are supposed to follow.
Right. And I think, part of it is representing God in this way that's honoring of God, and that's keeping the right place rather than grasping a name for yourself, trying to be your own God, but finding your appropriate place as God's image and God's representatives without trying to make your own way as your own God. But you're right that it's not completely spelled out here.
Here's a quick question. That phrase that gets translated in Genesis 3, where it says, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall lord it over you. And I thought I came across that again, where sin is crouching and his desire is for you.
Yeah.
And then there's this theme of taking and grasping something looks good.
Yeah.
Are those connected, or are they different?
That's a good question. The word that's used in the Genesis 3, I think, is different from the word that's used about what humans are supposed to do over creation. The rule over is this word mashal, which means it can to rule, have authority, can be used about kings and stuff like that. Let me see if it's the same word or not in Genesis 1 when they're supposed to, have dominion over the. It's a different word about having dominion over the created world.
So
But
that desire for is to have dominion over?
no, those are two different things.
Oh, okay.
Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Those are two different words. But also that word for rule is different from the words for rule used in Genesis 1.
Right, but my question was that phrase where it says, sin is crouching,
Yeah.
its desire shall be for you.
Those are the same words, yes, in those two. I mean, there does seem to be this, a theme of right and wrong, kind of rule and authority, for one thing. And like in the Genesis 3, I see that, your desires for your husband, he'll rule over you, is just a kind of negative outpouring. Like before, the man and woman were equal, they had a relationship of equality and mutual love, and now there's this element of competition and rule in human relationships, and so that would be a negative kind of rule. Whereas when God says that to Cain, sin's desires for you, but you must rule over it. It is the same word, but that would be a positive mastering and rule, and like in Genesis 1, humans are supposed to rule over the earth, and that also those words can be used of bad kinds of rulers as well, bad kinds of rule, and so there seems to be kind of good kinds of exercising authority and bad kinds.
Yeah, what I was thinking was that this thing about making a name for yourself or trying to, grasp something that isn't meant for you,
Right.
is the same thing. It's
Yeah,
a kind of
right.
disorderly desire.
Right. Yeah.
The desire mechanism is screwed up.
Right. Yes. Great point. And here also, I think the human rule has a little bit of a more negative cast, because it talks about the fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, which was not mentioned in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 1, God didn't give humans animals as food. He gave them every plant. And so, at least in the conception of this text, it seems like that eating animals is a concession to human violence almost. It's a God saying, okay, I don't think, it's hard to answer Becky's question about what changes here, because, and Walter Brueggemann says that humans don't change, God changes, and God, in the face, God says, you know, human's heart is evil from his youth, but I'm not going to destroy the earth. So something makes God say, I'm not going to do this again, even though humans are still evil. And then he gives them animals to eat, and animals seem to be playing, you know, an important role both in Genesis 1 and here. And like I said, it's almost a concession to human violence. You can't kill people, you can kill animals for food, but there's still a rule around that. You can't eat the blood because the blood represents the life, and that will be really important when you get to more rules about sacrifice and things like that. The blood plays an important role, and people can't eat the blood. The blood is used in sacrifice for cleansing the tabernacle and the temple. And it represents life. And interestingly, even into the New Testament, in Acts 15, when the Jerusalem Council meets, and some Jews are saying that Gentiles have to follow all the laws of the Torah, the Jerusalem Council meets to decide what rules the Gentiles who are joining this movement need to follow, and one of the few rules they need to follow is don't eat blood. And so that's, you know, going back to Genesis all the way to Acts, there's this prohibition against eating the blood of animals because it represents the life. So I think it's a kind of an important rule here. There's this idea, like I said, that humans can eat animals, they can't eat the blood, they should not kill other humans. Even, it sounds like animals are held responsible if they kill humans, it looks like here. That for your own lifeblood, I'll require a reckoning from every animal, I will require it from every human being. So humans and animals are still in it together, and I didn't put up the text here, but right after this, God makes a covenant with Noah, and this is the first time the word covenant is used. And God not only makes a covenant with Noah, but he makes a covenant with the animals. And so it's not only, this very first covenant that's made is made not with people, but with all the living creatures. So it says in verse 9, I now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come. So not even with just Noah and his family, but the humans that are continuing from them. And with every living thing that is with you, birds, cattle, and every wild beast as well, and all that have come out of the ark, every living thing on earth. I will maintain my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So this very first covenant of God is made not only with humans, but also with animals, that God isn't going to destroy the world, and the rainbow is the sign of the flood. So you have this repeated blessing that's just the same blessing that was given at creation, be fruitful and multiply. The commands about eating meat and shedding blood, the covenant that is made with both the people and the animals, and this sign, the rainbow is the sign. And then we don't have time to get into this text, but one part of the story that's not usually focused on is Noah, this new Adam. He plants a garden, a vineyard. He's the first one who plants a vineyard and makes wine. So again, we have this kind of Adam picture of a person tilling the ground, making a garden, and then he gets drunk and naked, and his son sees him, or maybe something more is going on. Some people think there's more of a sexual indiscretion there. And then there's this curse. He curses not only his son, but his son's son, Canaan. At any rate, it's Noah, who's supposed to be this new Adam, and he is a positive figure, ends up naked and ashamed, just like Adam did. And so it's a kind of common biblical pattern that you have after a high point, you have a kind of a crash after that. For example, like when people you have the Garden of Eden, and then Adam and Eve's disobedience. You have making the covenant at Mount Sinai, and then the golden calf. And so even in this beautiful picture of new creation, you have a new Adam who is a positive figure. I think Noah is a positive figure, but it's still not enough to kind of start humanity off on this a totally new thing. And yet God continues to work with Noah's line. And I think, I don't think the flood is either, the kids cute Noah's Ark, and I don't think it's either that, or it's that, skeleton image of just a picture of God's judgment, like Sandy said. It's kind of a both and. And I think it is, when we look around our violent world, it is sometimes hard to imagine how this world continues in the face of all this violence and destroying the environment as well. And yet, you know, spring, summer and winter, seed time and harvest, sun and moon, so far, they're still going by God's grace in the face, you know, even though human wickedness continues. So we'll pick up on it again next week as we see what happens with Noah's line and the Tower of Babel and people making a name for themselves once again. So thanks, everybody.